This podcast is brought to you by the Clare and Gilbert Valleys Council. Hello and welcome back to another episode highlighting the latest news and views and issues from right across the Clare and Gilbert Valleys region. I'm your host, Annabelle Homer. You may or may not have noticed, but the Medstar helicopter hasn't been landing at the Clare Hospital as much as it used to. There are claims it's because most retrievals have been directed to the Clare Aerodrome as the landing pad has been considered unsafe.
Something's got to give. Either the hospital landing site has to be improved quick smart, or we have to see some funding made available to the Clare Aerodrome.
We'll find out more about this with Dr Jerry Considine and what's been done to fix the problem. Also, are you planning on building a house or a shed or even a larger scale chicken yard? How much do you know about the current planning code? Who approves your development? Or maybe you're not happy about your neighbour's new tourism venture. Is there much wriggle room when it comes to disputes?
If you don't like a decision, you've got to look at it from the flip side. Imagine if you wanted to build something and your neighbour didn't like it. Do you want them to have the right to then say, no, I don't like that shed, you can't put it there because I don't approve of it? Your neighbour's not authority. And if it's consistent with the zone requirements, there should be no reason for it not to be approved.
I sit down with the Council's Director of Community and Development, Andrew Christensen, to talk 101 planning and development. But first, all the latest news from Council headquarters with CEO Dr Helen Macdonald. Newly elected councillor Tania Furler has asked for a leave of absence from council meetings. However, since this request, the SA Electoral Commission has advised the Clare and Gilbert Valleys Council that Ms Furler is no longer an elected member as she failed to lodge a disclosure return. So what is this disclosure return and what does this mean for council? Dr Helen Macdonald has the details.
Well, Tania is now not eligible to take leave of absence because she's been caught up in the exercise where there's been a number of councillors and mayors who did not complete their last return in terms of the expenditure that they did or did not make as part of the election process. So any candidate that stands for election, they put in a return initially and then they have to put another return in at the end of the election. So once the elections have been declared, whether they were successful or not, they have to put in a return to say how much money they did or did not spend. And unfortunately, Tania did not get that return in, so she is deemed ineligible to sit on council. However, she does have the opportunity to appeal her case, which I understand from her that she does intend to appeal that. So if that appeal is successful, then she'll be back as a councillor, and I assume she may at that point ask for a leave of absence.
And how long can you take a leave of absence for?
I think it's really at the discretion of the council, and no doubt it depends on circumstances of the councillor concerned.
Isn't it best interest for all councillors to attend meetings?
If you're elected, then yes, you should be there to represent the interests of ratepayer, but obviously things happen in people's lives and those things, sometimes it can be difficult to undertake those responsibilities that you initially put your hand up for.
So if her appeal is unsuccessful, what will council have to do?
That becomes a little bit unclear, and my understanding is that the Electoral Commission is seeking advice because with the recent changes to the Local Government Act, it allowed for a countback system, which is really to, I suppose, save money so you don't have to go out for a supplementary election. So if there were unsuccessful candidates doing a countback, it would be the next candidate that would be asked whether or not they want to sit on council. If they say yes, all done and dusted, so then a new face will appear on council. If they say no, then it's a question about, is there a supplementary election? Or if a council has a policy that says if there's a vacancy, which this is a Clare and Gilbert Valleys Council's position, if there's a vacancy, casual vacancy, then it won't be filled. So the council had decided that it does not want to spend the money on a supplementary election. It thinks it can adequately or move forward adequately by having a smaller number of elected members.
The Clare Flying group approached council seeking funding for 2 helipads at the Clare Aerodrome. The group says it will help attract more businesses to the aerodrome and provide sustainable landing pads for the CFS and Medevac helicopters, who have been using the aerodrome more frequently. because the helicopter pilots are claiming the hospital site is unsafe due to trees and dust issues. The group is in the process of applying for a Department of Infrastructure and Transport grant of $100,000. However, there's a shortfall of around $95,000. So, should Council foot the bill?
Council spent quite a lot of time talking about it, but they didn't make any decision about it until the very end of the Council meeting. And the decision they made was, they appreciated being asked, but given the very tight time frame and the lack of information, they did not feel that they could be committing ratepayers' funds to this particular project at this time, although they certainly consider any application in the future. They also, I think, pretty strongly pointed out, not so much in the decision but in the discussion, was that supporting health is not the role of local government. That is the role of the state, and they didn't want to provide the state with any opportunity to shirk its responsibility by stepping in and supplementing a service that the state should be providing.
The Clare Hospital has a plan in place to mitigate the risks. The hospital has started implementing the recommended upgrades to make it safe for daytime retrievals. It's also working with the Department of Infrastructure and Transport to make the pad safe for day and night retrievals. I'll be covering this story in more detail later on in the podcast with Dr. Jerry Considine. In the news lately, we found out that Japanese encephalitis has been detected in the Clare Valley. What procedures have been put in place on a council level in relation to this?
So this is a complicated exercise where the Department of Health has required impacted councils to undertake mosquito monitoring. So we partnered with the Goyder Council because they also had this requirement in some of their locations. So we now have mosquito traps in a number of places which we have to monitor, collecting samples and send to the department for testing. This involved staff time, which, it's not something we've done before. Staff had to be trained. We have to get supplies to be able to undertake that testing. And now that Japanese encephalitis has been discovered in Clare, then it sounds like we will have to be undertaking spraying as well as part of the mitigation program.
And how long will you have to continue to do this?
Presumably throughout the summer months until the period in which mosquitoes become inactive. I don't know whether it will become an annual activity that we have to provide or whether it's just a once-off because of the wet year and the extensive flooding that has happened with the Murray River.
Where is the money coming from? Is this coming from ratepayers or is this coming from the state?
Well, the Department of Health have had a grant from the federal government. As part of them dispensing that grant, then they've provided funds to some local governments to be able to undertake this testing. So some of our costs are being covered, but now that sounds like we have to implement a spraying regime, we are not sure how far those funds will go. We anticipate the expenditure is going to be beyond what that funding was. So I suspect at the end of the day it will be ratepayers that end up certainly supplementing it. If it's an activity that has to be done annually, ratepayers will be paying for it.
Where was the Japanese encephalitis found?
It was in one of the sentient fowls that is just like a backyard chook that somebody has. The department has a number of hens or chickens in various people's properties and they take blood samples on a regular basis to determine whether or not they've been, there's a bird that's been bitten by a mosquito carrying that virus.
Really? They have a program like that?
They do have a program like that. A little while ago, an advert went out for people that wanted to have a chook. I think there were a lot more people that were subscribers to wanting to have a free chook in their backyard.
The options report has been complete, detailing 3 options for improving the use of the stage at the Clare Town Hall. Option A is to retain the existing stage but put a lift in for disabled use. Option B, lower the stage, or option C, flat floor stage. So, which option is the council considering?
Council didn't make any decision about the options, and nor did administration ask them to. We essentially wanted them to understand there was a range of options, primarily because Council has a commitment to making upgrades to the Clare Town Hall, and it's kind of the challenge about, do you spend a significant amount of funds to repair something and then come back a few years later and and do something completely different. So trying to think ahead and make an investment which is in line with what the long-term plan is, and as it's turned out, what is required to be done to fix the stage is appearing to be quite significant. Not necessarily as expensive as what the option report that we were provided with by the architects, because the costing was done by a cost planner who always are incredibly conservative with their figures, and they would have used metropolitan figures, and so it may well be cheaper for us to have something done more locally. However, and we don't know that until we go out and to get a pricing on it. The decision that council made was it wanted us to undertake some consultation with the Clare Hall committee, and also they wanted the opportunity to inspect the town hall as well. So administration had already included that as part of the annual district tour, to go and have a look at the town hall, probably several town halls, and just understand the work that needs to be undertaken to bring them up to a safe standard, let alone improve them so that they can provide a better service to the community. So there's a lot more use of those particular facilities.
Are we talking years until something might be happening with the stage?
Not sure that I can answer that. I think one of the things that was weighing on at least some of the councillors was the fact that we have the Riverton Town Hall that has significant issues. I mean, it was in line to be refurbished just before that process in terms of coming up with a list of what those refurbishment activities would be. It was identified that there were significant structural issues, so that all had to be investigated and understand what needed to be done to fix it. A report should be going to council at the March meeting, which will outline what that cost will be. And so I think there were certainly some councillors that didn't want to make the decision in the absence of having the full understanding about what sort of money needed to be provided to fix the Riverton Town Hall. So
there could be a cost blowout at Riverton.
There'll be significant costs that'll be required to repair the Riverton Town Hall and obviously refurbishments. But the other thing is, if we know what the total cost is to do refurbishments of the Riverton Town Hall and also possibly the Clare Town Hall, there's the opportunity to apply for grants for both of them as part of council addressing the needs of the community. Yes, it will probably take longer, but in the interest of the ratepayer that we get support to do these activities than ratepayers having to fund it all themselves.
All right. Well, Helen, thank you very much for your time today, and I'll catch up with you after the next council meeting.
Certainly. Happy to do so.
Clare Valley Podcast.
Clare Valley Podcast.
You're listening.
Clare Valley Podcast.
Clare Valley Podcast.
Have you got plans to build a new carport or a shed perhaps, or maybe start a new tourism development? How much do you know about getting development approval? Or maybe someone's building a shed next door that's blocking your view and you're not happy about it. What right do you have to dispute it? The current state planning legislation is very pro-development, so it is very difficult to block a development. I sat down with Andrew Christensen, the Council's Director of Development and Community, to find out more about the process, who has the power to approve applications, and where does the public sit on disputes. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be talking about quite a cumbersome topic, planning, development in the Clare Valley region. We could be here all day, but we're going to focus on certain parts of it. Can you tell me the relationship between local councils and Plan SA?
So Plan SA is actually a portal and an information port for people that want to lodge development applications. So if we take a step back, pre-July 2020, local council used to be where you'd submit your development applications in. It was in a hard copy form. And now post 2020 or mid 2020, Plan SA, the portal had been created, and now you have to lodge everything online. And we also have what's called the Planning and Design Code, is which you assess development applications against. Previously, each individual council used to have what was called a development plan, and that's what you used to assess it against. Now it's a whole statewide code. So a residential zone in our council area would be the same as a residential code in the neighbouring council area, while previously they were all slightly different. If you think of Plan SA is a product of the state government, and it sits within, I think, the Department of Planning and Land Use Services, which sits in another department, which probably sits in another department, to confuse people. Essentially, if you want to do anything, you need to lodge with development application through Plan SA, the portal, and then the portal will send it to my council planners, and they will determine who is the relevant authority. Is it council, or does it have to go to the state government for assessment? Now, when you think of council is no longer the relevant authority. It is the planners that sit within council that are the relevant authority, or what's called a regional assessment panel, and that depends on the type of development you're lodging. So it all sounds very confusing, but there is actually a bit of a flowchart when it comes to all of this.
So let's talk about the power. Where does the power lie, say, compared to council and Plan SA?
Previously, what happened was the minister would delegate his powers, his planning powers, to the council, who would then delegate them to the CEO, who would then delegate it to council officers. That doesn't happen anymore. So what actually happens is the planning powers are delegated to either the regional assessment panel or the assessment manager. I am the assessment manager for councils. So Clare and Gilbert Valleys, Wakefield, Northern Areas and Goyder Council. And what I do is when I get a development application, I use my delegations to go to the council staff who can then assess it. The regional assessment panel is the relevant authority for certain development applications, so usually larger ones where you'll get publicly notified. So not everything gets publicly notified. If you build a shed, it will generally just go to the assessment manager, and then that'll be delegated to a council planning officer who will then assess your shed and approve it through that process there. However, if it's a big thing like, I don't know, some massive chicken farm that has triggers that needs to be publicly notified, then the panel would be the relevant authority for that one.
What about a tourism development?
They've got triggers as well. So if it's a certain type of development, like if it's over a certain amount of square metres or otherwise, it would trigger the need for public notification, and then the panel would be the relevant authority. And that's only if you get what they call representations. And that's someone writing in to the panel and saying, I don't like this development. Now, if no one writes in, then the panel automatically delegates that down to the assessment manager, and then we can approve that through that process there.
So who's on the panel?
There's 5 accredited professionals. So previously, under the old system, there would be a councillor and then 4 professionals, if you will, that would sit on the panel. Now there's 5 accredited professionals. Essentially, you need a certain amount of planning skill set to sit on that panel, and there's 5 independent members that sit on there. So
you professional people, are we talking, architects or engineers?
Correct.
Do they have to have some type of connection with development?
Yeah, generally yes, but what's key is they need to be accredited professionals, and it's a certain type of accreditation that you need through the new planning system. Previously, you didn't have to be accredited to sit on the panel. Now you do, and that's to basically up the skill level of the panels, because some of them, no offence, but some of them had lower skill levels. They have to, have 10 or 20 professional development points or something like that per year to keep their planning skills up to date. Generally, they tend to be planners, but you can get architects, engineers, all that sort of stuff.
What about someone with the environment or someone from a totally different field? Because I presume if you're all planners or developers, you'd be very much pro-development.
Yeah, no, anyone could do it,
okay.
But you need to be an accredited professional. And actually, when we do hire the panel, so the way that it's actually done within our council area is that our panel sits over 4 other councils, which I talked about before, and then a councillor from each one of those councils sit on the recruitment panel, and then they interview the people that want to go on it, and we try to get kind of a mix of skill sets. So, you get someone that's got an environmental background, or you get someone that's got an architectural background. What's key, though, is that they need to be accredited professionals. So they could be an architect, but they also need to be accredited professionals under the planning system.
Who's on the panel at the moment?
Stephen Smith is the presiding member. He works for the LGA. There's Aaron Broome, who's from the Department of Environment and Water, so he's got that sort of environmental lens, which is quite handy. There's Julie Lewis, who was a planning consultant. There's Adam Squires, who actually he comes from Auburn originally, but he is the assessment manager down in Salisbury Council, I think it is, Salisbury or Playford. And then there is John Brack, who used to be the CEO at Goyder Council, and he's retired now, but he sits on a bunch of assessment panels. He used to be a planner.
So they're all government people. There's no private enterprise. There's
no. Julie is private, so Julie's a consultant. But no. You need to meet those accredited professional requirements, and I think that's a bit of a turn off for people. It is actually a bit of a problem that has been raised that it needs to have that sort of thing. So yeah.
At what stage does the Regional Assessment Panel actually start to hear submissions from the public?
What happens is you would lodge a development application. If it is required to go out for public notification, all the neighbours will be told. They'll get a letter from council saying this is available, please have a look at the plans and provide us your representation saying you like it, you don't like it, or you don't have to reply. It's up to you how you do that. If there's negative representations, then that will be part of a report which goes to the panel, and a recommendation will be provided by a planning officer to the panel, and it could be for approval or refusal for the development application. As part of that report, there'll be a whole series of documents that go with it, including every one of the representations that have been made, and so the panel can read those, and then you have a meeting. We do one once a month, and then people have the opportunity to say how they feel about that particular development. They get 5 minutes to do so.
There have been claims that the process of going through the panel is just a tick of the box, and that the panel already has made a decision prior to hearing from the public.
The panel will hear representations, and the panel can change its mind based on those representations.
Does that happen?
Not
often?
a lot. I mean, a lot of the time people complain because they don't want something next door to them. Just because it's not next door to them and they don't want it doesn't mean it's unlawful, doesn't mean it's inconsistent with the code, doesn't mean all these sorts of things. Now, we've had examples where people say, I just don't want it next to me. Now, that is not a planning consideration. What the panel can do, and I've seen it do this a couple of times, is where representations have been made and they've said, look, there's a traffic safety problem around here. We're really concerned about that. And it hasn't really been addressed enough within the report. And so the panel's gone, okay, let's defer the decision and get them to make a traffic assessment report. And then that traffic assessment report was done. It turned out that it was okay, and then the panel approved the development accordingly. So what actually happens is, and I missed probably a step here, representations are made through the public notification process. Those representations actually go to the applicant, and the applicant has a right to respond to those representations. And often you actually get them going, oh, actually, this is an issue, and they try to address those concerns through that process. And then it goes to the panel. Now, if your position is like, I'm just trying to throw things at something to make sure that it doesn't move ahead, that's okay. You can do that. You're allowed to say whatever you want in terms of your representation. But the reality is the panel needs to assess it against the code, and it also needs to hear what the public think about it as well. But the public doesn't outweigh the code.
But the code is very pro-development, isn't it?
Yes, the code is definitely pro-development. The new changes that have been made means there's less avenues for refusal from the authority. In the old development plan, there was particular land uses which were identified as non-complying, which means you could still get approval, but it was a very difficult process. Now that doesn't exist under the new system. There's things called restricted, but that's extremely small amount of land uses that are restricted now.
Like what?
Certain types of industry within a residential zone, for example, those sorts of things which are clearly out of step with what it is. You could argue that they've gone too far, but the argument is that the code will say the type of land uses that should be within that zone, and if it's not consistent with that, then the development application should be refused. Okay. You shouldn't actually have a list of saying these type of land uses are not okay, because in some circumstances, a certain land use can actually work in a zone, even though it's not quite consistent with what the zone is looking for. So
if we take a look at tourism, are decisions regarding planning consent for tourism different when it comes to private development? Say, for example, local council regulates that there be only one dwelling per 1,500 square metres. However, when it's tourism-related development, multiple buildings can be placed on the same block.
I'm not aware of those specific numbers. Depends on the zone. So if you're in a rural zone, for example, you might be able to put more tourist accommodation on there than if you got dwellings, for example. In a rural zone, you can only generally have 2 dwellings, and the second dwelling usually has to be in association with the primary production use and that sort of things. There's certain caveats on things. But in terms of a dwelling or tourist accommodation, I don't know. It just depends on the zone and what the restrictions are in regards to that. So
when it comes to tourism, the planning consent rules are the same as it is for private development. Nothing's different.
So all tourism development is private development. It's not public development. It's always done by a private holder or landholder. But yeah, all development applications, including public, private, whatever, have to be assessed against the code. So there isn't sort of one rule for council and one rule for private. It is just, this is what the code says. Yep. And if council was going to submit a development application which was inconsistent with that zone, the officers should put it up for refusal. That's basically the way that it should be. So
other rules regarding sightlines, access, traffic, building codes and whether a development was sympathetic to the local area all seem to be given less weight or disregarded with a tourism development.
I don't agree with that. Depends on your view of certain developments. So we have to assess it against the code. So if it's a dwelling, for example, if there's a 4-storey dwelling there and it is against those sorts of provisions, then, you know, that will give us grounds for refusal. So it just depends on the type of development that it is. I suppose when people get concerned around tourism is that, you know, they're worried about parties and all those sorts of things.
Increased traffic, that sort of thing. I would argue against that because if you've got a bad neighbour, they are permanently there, permanently problematic. So I think people probably think about maybe a short-term problem is better than a long-term problem. But that being said, most people actually have really good neighbours too. So, you know, there's a lot of B&Bs out there and we generally actually don't get complaints about them. I think people do get concerned about tourist accommodation being next to them because of the transient nature of that. Like they don't know who those people are as opposed to knowing their neighbour. Let's go back to Plan SA. Is the council able to overrule consent decisions made by Plan SA and vice versa, say, when it comes to those major developments?
So Plan SA isn't an authority. So Plan SA is a portal. Yeah. So it's either the assessment
state
manager or the panel.
Then.
Yeah. So no, because it's still not state government. It is either the regional assessment panel, which is an authority, or the assessment manager is an authority. Essentially, the state government provides those planning powers to those two authorities, right? Council isn't an authority when it comes to planning decisions anymore. It's been completely removed from the process. So if you're lodging a development application, who would be assessing it and authorising it is either the regional assessment panel or the assessment manager, one of those two entities, those what we call them relevant authorities, basically.
So the minister doesn't step in at any point in time?
No. The only time he would is if it was what's called a restricted development, and then if it's a restricted development it would go to what's called the State Commission Assessment Panel, which is essentially a regional assessment panel but the state government's version of that. So major developments go through that process. You know, if you were going to do let's just say a desalination plant, that would generally go to SCAP and they would do the assessment through that process there.
So the final consent is with the regional assessment panel or your local planning authority?
Yeah, assessment manager, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Which is you?
Which is me, yeah. Or a delegate of me.
Once a decision's been made by the regional assessment panel, but the public still disagrees with their decision, what process can the public take?
There is no process. So
there's nothing they can do.
Correct.
They can't get their lawyers involved and take it further.
No, that right was taken away as part of the planning legislation changes. Yes.
Really?
Yep. So there used to be what was called Cat 3 development applications, and Cat 3 would go to the panel, same process, but then if you didn't agree with the decision of the panel, you could take it to the ERD court. Yeah, so that sort of thing. There is differences because I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. For example, if the assessment manager makes a decision which you don't agree with, you can then go to the panel, ask them to review that decision, or you can ask the court to review that decision. But if it's gone to the panel already, there is really no avenue for taking it to court further. So
where does the ombudsman step in?
I suppose the ombudsman steps in if you have not done your process correctly. People think, I don't like the decision, I'll go to the ombudsman. Good luck to them, because they'll get told by the ombudsman there's nothing wrong here, you just don't happen to like the decision that's been made. So people get confused about that. The ombudsman cares about process. Were the correct processes undertaken in order to make a decision? Just because you don't like the decision doesn't mean it's a wrong decision. It's just that you don't like the decision. And that's the same with the panel. So you go through the right processes. You've got the opportunity to say you don't like it or do like it or whatever, because people that do like the development can also write in and say they do like the development as well, which is an important consideration, because in I've seen some, there'll be 2 or 3 that are fiercely against and, 10 or 20 that are great. So if you work on majority rules here,
Yeah.
you would say, oh, well, the development should proceed. You could say to the Ombudsman, oh, look, this hasn't been done correctly. There is actually a similar process where you could actually do what's called a judicial review. And that, again, looks at the process as well. Like, if you think there's some corruption that's going on here, you can do that. But that's an extremely expensive process because it's eventually going to the judiciary or whatever, not one of the high courts or something like that to get it done. And if the foundation for you not wanting the development to proceed is because you don't like the development, that doesn't mean the process has been incorrect. It just means that you don't like that decision. So that's essentially what it is. If you don't like a decision, you've got to look at it from the flip side. Imagine if you wanted to build something and your neighbour didn't like it. Do you want them to have the right to then say, no, I don't like that shed, you can't put it there because I don't approve of it? Your neighbour's not authority. And if it's consistent with the zone requirements, there should be no reason for it not to be approved.
The legislation that we've been talking about is now under review. Is it
Yes.
under review because it is pro-development and needs to go back to the drawing board? Why is it under review?
No, it's under review because it's part of their constant improvement processes. So if you make a statewide code, there's going to be holes in it, and it's not the code, it's the legislation, it's the portal, it's the whole
It's everything.
planning system. Yeah,
Okay.
it's the lot. So
So that's going to take a while.
Well, it's actually, they have to do their report by April this year. So the review's been going on for some time. I think it's good that they're reviewing it. They should review it because the change is enormous that's actually happened. People don't realise it. I mean, there used to be 72 development plans. Now there's one. The relevant authorities have changed. Things like Cat 3 have gone. There's all these things, quite monumental changes in their own right. It's completely digital. There's no hard you can't do anything by hard copy anymore.
And it was John Rao that changed the legislation, wasn't it?
So it started back in 2016, I think. That's when this whole process started. They did a review of the planning system and then they basically enacted a lot of the recommendations of the panel. They created this expert review panel, similar to what they're doing at the moment. But yeah, that's how they kind of landed where they are.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for explaining some of the process when it comes to planning and development. I'm sure we just scraped the surface. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than what we've talked about today, but I do appreciate it and hopefully the listeners do appreciate it as well.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
There are claims that the Medstar helicopter is bypassing the Clare Hospital and landing at the Clare Aerodrome because the hospital's helipad is unsafe. High trees and dust issues are some of the factors deeming the landing area unsuitable. This has been an issue for a few months, and the Clare Flying group's concerned if it becomes a long-term issue, the current infrastructure won't be able to maintain the frequent helicopter landings. The group is seeking funds from the state and local government to invest in a new helipad at the aerodrome. Jerry Considine is a local Clare Valley GP and pilot and says the state government needs to step up to ensure there is a long-term viable helicopter retrieval service in the valley.
So for many years, the helicopters have been coming up from Adelaide with a Medstar crew or retrieval crew, and they are there to support us managing quite sick patients and then retrieving them back down to Adelaide. As many of your listeners will know, there's a helipad at the back of the hospital, which provides a really close access for that helicopter to land and those teams to come. And unfortunately, in the last few months, we've heard there's been some issues with those helicopters landing behind the hospital.
What are the issues?
Yeah, from what we have been told, the issues have got to do with the large gum trees surrounding the helipad, but also the surrounding area. So there's dust that gets kicked up by the helicopter downwash, and it's hard for the pilots to actually see the landing place, which is kind of crucial as a helicopter pilot to see where you're landing. These are the two main issues we've been told with the helipad at the back of the Clare Hospital, especially at night time.
Well, what's the hospital doing to try and mitigate these issues?
We've seen the helicopter diverted out to the Clare Aerodrome, which is about 15 kilometres north of the town. And for that to happen, obviously, a local ambulance crew has to attend the Clare airstrip to bring the medical team back to the Clare Hospital, and then with the patient and the medical team go back out to the Clare Aerodrome. So it's a big process. The poor volunteer ambos have to act as a taxi service where when the team lands behind the hospital, they just walk up into the back door and they're there. So it is good to have a place that the helicopters can land out at the airstrip that is safer, but for best care of patients and for the use of our volunteer crews having to spend time going out there and back, it's not ideal for the longer term.
What's the hospital doing then to ensure that that helipad at the hospital can be used in the future?
We had a meeting with our Director of Nursing, which we do regularly, as the doctor and nurse team does. What we were told last time was that they're looking at some strategies around reducing the amount of dust that gets blown up. I'm not sure about the Gumtree situation, but we've been told that the hospital's looking into that issue, because as a doctor team we would really like to see helicopters back landing at the hospital for that patient care and for the volunteer ambulance resource usage, as I mentioned before.
From what you can understand, has anything been done?
Not at this stage, but we haven't asked the question specifically. We have those meetings every month or so it'll be, I think, it's a standing item on the agenda from memory. So we trust that our hospital leaders are looking into this, because it's in their best interest too to have the best care for patients. So
and it's been for a couple of months now?
That's my understanding, yeah.
And it's only been nighttime retrievals that have been affected?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen where the helicopters have been landing recently, but...
So you think it could be day and night?
That's my understanding, yeah. I've seen the helicopter out at the Clare airstrip during the day as well, but again, without talking to the pilots and the Medstar teams, I'm not sure for the reasons that they decide. It might be even a crew-by-crew thing. There might be some pilots that are happy to land at the Clare airstrip, but there might be some that aren't.
There's been calls now from the Clare Flying group. They're wanting funding to install or build helipads at the aerodrome because of this reason?
Yes, the problem with helicopters landing on the current bitumen site, which some listeners will know is a fairly big area next to the terminal building at the Clare airstrip. It's a bitumen pad. It's not set up for multiple helicopter landings, and especially large helicopters which come up to retrieve patients. And the risk then is that bitumen surface is degraded, which not only jeopardises future helicopter landings, but also the other aircraft movements that happen at the Clare airstrip. So the Clare Aerodrome and the committee there have spent a lot of time and funding getting that up and running and to bitumise the whole area. It'd be a real shame to see that degraded and damaged by ongoing helicopter use. Look, we would understand if that's a short-term process, but if this is something that's going to be months and months on end, something's got to give. Either the hospital landing site has to be improved quick smart, or we have to see some funding made available to the Clare Aerodrome. And this is something that also would benefit for firefighting capabilities. The CFS, we know they have a base down with Aerotech at Hoylton, but as a launch pad for local fires, it would be beneficial to have a place for larger helicopters to land in the future.
Clare Flying Group has approached the Department of Infrastructure and Transport for a grant, but there's about $95,000 that the group is still needing to go ahead with a helipad. I understand that the health minister's been approached on this. What's been the response from SA Health?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the response from SA Health at this stage, but that funding clearly we would like to come from somewhere.
And it's a health issue.
It's a health issue.
Primarily.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's open to any and all comers. We'd like the state government to chip in. It'd be great. The local council, I think, also is looking into their budget as well. It benefits the community as a whole. So, that money really does need to come from somewhere.
Is there a timeline on this?
No.
I mean, to the point where if you have to constantly keep upgrading the aerodrome because of these helicopter retrievals,
it'll end up costing more money down the track. That's absolutely certain, depending on how long it plays out for. So there's always timelines that are put out there. I haven't heard any, but it'll be ideal to have it sorted or have some certainty of when things are going to happen sooner rather than later for that integrity of the airstrip. And as a pilot myself, and I do outreach clinics as a doctor, it'll put me out if I'm not able to taxi through that area if the helicopter has damaged it. So it has a big flow-on effect.
Have you noticed the damage there already?
No, not at this stage, but even the truck that comes to refuel the fuel tank out at the airstrip, even that, if it turns too sharply, can damage the surface. So, if we're seeing that happen, then multiple landings from a helicopter is guaranteed that will happen. We have lots of helicopter landings in the Clare Hospital. I can't put a number on that, but your listeners would know you hear the helicopter overhead at least a few times a week, certain times. But places like I work in Borough as well, and the helicopter's able to land over at the Oval. It's obviously a lot quieter than the Clare Oval. But essentially at the moment, Borough has a better retrieval service than a hospital like Clare because it's so much closer to the hospital. So, yeah, we would definitely like to see funds earmarked for Clare Hospital helipad to be upgraded. We are a busy hospital. We have a big patient catchment. We look after patients from all around, so we would see it as a priority for sure.
If it's all about just reducing the dust and just cutting down some trees, isn't essentially that's what needs to happen?
From my understanding, that's it. But as we know in state government, things have to go through committees and reviews, so that's where we get an issue with the time frame. But yeah, look, we are very supportive, and as a doctor team, really want to make sure that doesn't get compromised, and that the Clare airstrip becomes the permanent option. We would like to see helicopters still landing for those patients that it's appropriate at the Clare Hospital.
And can the helicopter land at the Clare Oval?
I haven't worked here for long enough, but I understand that it used to. But obviously, there's lots of different activities. There's I don't know if the subcommittees would appreciate helicopter. Well, actually, they probably would. I know my boys would love a helicopter to land in the middle of football practice, but no, it's a too busy a place for that to happen. Is my understanding.
Bit of a construction happening.
That's
at the moment,
right.
yeah.
A small project happening on the western side, and I believe that's where it might have been the time frame that the helipad behind the hospital was constructed, purpose built for that reason. So, we'd be a real shame to lose that as an asset.
All right, Jerry, thank you. It will be interesting to see what happens after this, whether the issue at the hospital will be fixed in the short term rather than the long term.
Fingers crossed.
Jerry Considine, Clare Valley GP and pilot. A statement was sent by SA Health regarding the helipad issue. It says the helipad remains available for transporting patients during daylight hours when required. Being an unsealed helipad, dust has been a concern, especially when it's dark. SA Health is playing its part to keep the helipad safe as possible by reducing dust through watering grassy areas and using appropriate dust suppression sprays. When the Medstar helicopter is unable to land at the Clare Hospital helipad, it is helpful for highly specialised retrieval team to be able to access the Clare Aerodrome facility. That's a wrap of another episode of the Clare Valley Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and possibly you're now a bit more up to speed on the current planning legislation. If there is an issue you would like covered in this podcast, or even a profile of a certain individual who has done a lot for their community, don't hesitate to get in contact. This podcast is brought to you by the Clare and Gilbert Valleys Council. I'm Annabelle Homer. I'll catch you next time.